So I want to jump in and build on a little bit of what we've talked about throughout the sessions yesterday and today. This first session we have here before another small break will be on implementation readiness, and then we talk about change management later at the end of the day. But there is quite a bit of overlap between the two. As we talk about implementation readiness, we'll inevitably talk about change management and vice versa. But before I dive into this, just a real quick reminder, how many of you are either in the midst of a transformation right now or you're about to start one? Okay, and just keep your hands up for a second if you don't mind. Of those of you with your hands up, how many of you are ready for it, or you feel like the organization's ready? Sort of ready. How about that? You're sort of, you're like in between.
How about not ready at all?
How about not ready at all? Who do you feel? All right.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Kind of a good mix there of some are ready, some not so ready. And the reality is just to be candid, no organization is ever ready, and you never feel 100% comfortable to move forward. So the key here today of what we want to talk about is how do we get ready enough to put ourselves in a good position for success. And the other thing I want to delineate too is that when we talk about implementation readiness, that's different than go live readiness. And that's something that comes later on as we're in the midst of an implementation. There comes a point where we have to do a series of checkpoints that would say, are we ready to go live? Are we ready to flip the switch and turn off the old system? All that good stuff. So this is very different. This is completely different than go live readiness. This is just, are we ready to start implementing? And what oftentimes industry people will try to suggest is, and you think about it from, again, I always try to empathize with where people are coming from and understanding human behavior of why things happen the way they do with human interactions. But if I'm a software vendor or system integrator, I want you to feel as ready as possible so you will just sign the damn contract and help me get the software sale and help me get the services sold or whatever the case may be. So that's the pressure you feel typically as an organization that's getting ready to move forward. And one of the big dynamics we see is that companies move too quickly from the time they make a decision on software, they sign their contracts, and they are going 100 miles an hour or 100 kilometers per hour, depending on where you're from, at full speed ahead. And during that time, there's critical decisions and planning that doesn't happen that should happen, but it's too late. We're already rolling, and the momentum tends to get out of control, and it can be hard to contain. So that's the dynamic we want to talk about: is what is that period, that critical period between the time we've decided or come close to deciding what our software and preferred technology roadmap is until we actually start deploying it, and what do we need to do during that critical moment in time. So some of the common challenges is that companies will pick the technology, they're riding a wave of momentum. People are generally pretty excited about the path forward. The project team is excited because they've got clarity around what we're going to do. We finally have a plan to replace our old crappy systems and processes. Hopefully we've got budgetary approval and executive approval to move forward, and we're ready to roll. So that the excitement level is typically the highest at that point in the project. Usually that's as high as the momentum and the excitement's going to get. I hate to break that to you, but that's usually the peak excitement level. What happens over time is it tends to drop, and there's a lot of challenges that come along with that. But at that moment in time, we are blinded by optimism and excitement, and we oftentimes don't make the right decisions and don't take the time to have a proper plan to move forward in a way that makes sense for us as an organization. And there's a lot of blind spots that come along with that, and that's what we'll talk about. One of the common things here too is because we're excited, we've signed the contract, and we don't know a better solution, we will typically delegate the transformation to the system integrator, the vendor, the VAR, whoever you're working with to do the technical implementation. We'll delegate a lot of this work to them, and they will tell us, let's go ahead and get started, let's start the workshops next week, and let's just start building stuff, and so we can design it, build it, test it, all that good stuff. And what oftentimes happens during these early stages too is these unrealistic expectations get baked in that critical moment from the time we selected software until we start moving forward. And once those unrealistic expectations are baked, they're extremely hard to change. And I've seen a lot of clients that will set a date or a budget number that gets baked into set in stone, and there's no backing off of that number. And that's an example of what we often see early in a process. So one of the terms I often use with clients, and our team has started to adopt this nomenclature as well. And I don't know where it came from. It just is a visual. I'm a very visual person, so everything has to relate to an analogy or a visual in some way for me to understand it. But I see a lot of clients that are what we call cliff diving, or what I think of as cliff diving. You're on the edge of a cliff, and it's just, doesn't matter how deep it is, doesn't matter if you've got a parachute or not, or the right equipment, just jump. Just trust us, jump, and you're going to be fine. And trust us, it's that kind of thing. So that cliff diving phenomena of where we pick the software and we're just going to dive right in and start doing stuff, it seems innocuous enough, it seems harmless, it seems like the right thing to do, but there's so many bad decisions or unresolved decisions that materialize during that critical step. And so what ends up happening is we start the project without clear operational direction. System integrator takes control of the project, largely because we don't have a solid plan or a clear direction of what we want out of this project. So the system integrator, by default, and in the absence of a better answer, is going to define that for us. This is a really common one. I think I alluded to this yesterday in one or two of the sessions, but a lot of times the decisions that need to be made are being made with the pressure of a meter running. There's a meter running on the consultants, and however many of them there are times whatever rate they're charging. That's a pretty expensive decision-making process that suddenly we're backed into. And the reality of it is that we should have made those decisions before we ever engaged the system integrator, but because we were told that we should bring the system integrator on now, that tends to be the dynamic that a lot of companies fall into. So one of two things happens here. Either we rush into a decision that we don't have alignment on, or is just not a good decision for the organization, or we slow things down and we take our time to make the decision, but it gets really expensive because we're paying by the hour while everyone waits for us to make these decisions. And so those are the two not so attractive choices we have in those types of situations. It often leads us to the technology driving the business rather than the business driving the technology. So the less we have a clear vision of what we want this project to be and what we want the project to accomplish for us, the more technology will fill that void for us, and technology will determine for us how we're going to operate. Not always a bad thing, as we've talked about before. There are certain processes that's okay, where the technology should define for us how we can make it better, but there are certain things that we need the process to drive the technology, either because it's really important to us or different for us as an organization, or because the software is so flexible that there are so many options and ways we could be deploying the technology that we need to define what makes the most sense for us. It's pretty rare that you have one answer on how a process or workflow should look in a system, even for something as basic as accounts payable or creating a purchase order, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made around that, and the better clarity we have around what we want the business to look like in the future, the better off we'll be. Leads to a little more time and money than we need to spend on a project. The team gets frustrated when we jump in and we start exposing some of the misalignment, and the challenges start to come out on the surface in a more dramatic way, in a more expensive way, in a riskier way, which leads to morale issues with the project. Oftentimes it's too much for the business to absorb all at once, and that leads to oftentimes a lack of internal ownership and buy-in. So these are just some of the symptoms that we see, or some of the challenges that stem from rushing ahead, even though, again, it's understandable why at that point when we're excited, we've signed the contracts, we might even have a deadline for when we need to be off our old system, which further exacerbates the problem. A lot of times companies know that they've got to be off by X date because the vendor's sunsetting the old technology, or they're going to stop supporting or whatever. That makes it even worse, because then we feel like we have to just start doing stuff. And the reality is, if we were to take a step back and get a plan in place, it feels like we're going slow, but we're actually speeding things up later on because we're aligned, we're a fine-tuned project machine that has a clear direction, and therefore we're going to roll out faster. So that's the hard part, is balancing how much time do we spend up front and how much can we tolerate and stomach the fact that it feels like we're going slow, but in reality we're speeding things up because we've got better alignment and clearer direction. So this is a whiteboard presentation I did, and I just haven't gotten around to putting this into a PowerPoint format, so I took a picture of the whiteboard. And so in the interest of time, this is what we have to work with right now, is this slide. So this is a presentation I gave around SAP, and you could forget SAP for a minute, apply any software vendor in its ecosystem, and this would apply. So SAP is a good example because it's probably the biggest, most extreme example. They're the biggest software vendor in the ERP space. They've created a big ecosystem that is paid by and supported by SAP, the big system integrators, the user groups within SAP, industry analysts like Forrester, Gartner, those guys, solo consultants that have grown up in the SAP space and they're drinking the SAP Kool-Aid and that's all they know is the SAP world. There's this whole ecosystem that's been built as sort of a machine to convert as many customers as possible to their new, whatever their new platform of the day is. Today it happens to be S4HANA. They've created this 2025 deadline to switch over to S4HANA. I doubt they'll stick to that, but as of right now, they're saying 2025 is the date that all SAP customers need to switch to HANA. If you're not an SAP customer and you're going to buy the software now, you're pretty much getting S4HANA. You don't really have a choice to go look at ECC or R3 or one of the legacy products because they're not going to be supporting it for much longer and they're not selling it aggressively right now. So that's one of the biases that's created by this ecosystem. Another bias is that everything is kind of an SAP first type of mentality. So let's figure out how to make SAP in this case work for the client. But again, it's not just SAP; it's any ERP vendor that would apply to. The concept of best practices further perpetuates the problem because there's the industry best practices that they're marketing that people like and they want to hear that we talked about yesterday. They're using the agile approach as a way to get started quickly. If we use an agile approach, we can just bite off this little piece of our deployment, start it now, which makes the readiness problem even worse because now we've honed in on one tiny little subset of our big transformation and we don't have a clear vision for this, but now we're just going to start doing stuff over here without having a sense of how it all ties together. So all these things lead to a bias and leads to, this is what customers hear. This is all they're really hearing in the space right now is this stuff. So again, in the absence of any better information or if you don't know any better, that's what you're being told by all these different parties and they're very aligned in their messaging. If you talk to any one of these parties, you're going to hear a very common, consistent message. And SAP and the big vendors especially are very good at crafting a very clear message that the entire ecosystem supports. Even just down to the nomenclature they use, like SAP uses, for example, digital core is something they use right now. It's their digital core, which to me is an excuse for the rest of the stuff's not done yet, so let's just focus on the digital core, and then we'll worry about that other stuff like manufacturing and all that those pesky details of our software. We'll figure that stuff out later.
Sounds really strong.
It does, like digital core. It's like
We've got it.
it's agile. It's we're getting the core. All right. So then what ends up happening here is that the executive team, and we kind of segment a customer into two layers. You've got the executive team who is hearing all this stuff here, and they usually believe this stuff. I mean, because again, it's the stuff that executives want to hear is that it's SAP can handle everything or ERP can handle everything. We've got best practices. We use Agile. We can get this done for you quickly. That's all the stuff we want to hear. So they're buying this. We're down here stuck with what's being handed to us as a project team, which is we have an unrealistic timeline. We don't have anything that's tailored for us. We haven't figured out how we're going to fill in the gaps of what the system integrator or the vendor can't do and what those risks are. We don't have the proper oversight of the system integrator, and that's what we're inheriting. So right now, you start a project, and we're kind of backed into a corner with these unrealistic expectations that have come in from the top, and now we're stuck deploying something that was never realistic. So not to paint a completely dire, dark picture, but that's the reality of what a lot of project teams get stuck with and how they get boxed into a tough situation. So a lot of what we try to do with our clients is, first of all, educate the executive team, because it all starts here, as we talked about, for those of you that were in the executive alignment session this morning. So much of this starts with getting the executives aligned and having realistic expectations and understanding what it is we're trying to accomplish and forcing them to make the decisions and the trade-offs that they have to make at the executive level so that we as a project team can support those clear decisions that they have made, not the project team. And so that's a very important differentiator that we try to help our clients through. So when we look at what causes a project to take a certain amount of time and money and risk, there's a few different layers. We have the software, the technology, and everything that goes along with the technology, like the system integrator, the implementation partners, your internal team that's supporting the project. They're all enabling an overall transformation that involves four major layers. You have the technical piece, which is just one of it, but then the rest of it is your processes, your people, and then just your overall business, what your business needs are. So what ends up happening though is a lot of times we make decisions or plan for just a technical implementation, but we haven't accounted for all the business, operational, and people side of things that are typically the things that are going to determine how long the project takes, how much it's going to cost, and how much risk there inevitably is. It's generally not as related to the technology, although the caveat to that is in today's transitionary stage that we're in right now, where technology for a lot of vendors is transitioning to the cloud, technology is also more of an issue now than it was 5 years ago because we're now dealing with immature products that aren't fully developed and they're not fully baked. And even once they are fully baked, which I don't know when that will be, but in a couple years, I'm sure they will be more fully baked than they are now. Now we've got to worry about how they integrate, all these different solutions integrate together. Like with SAP, for example, or Infor, even Microsoft Dynamics has more of an acquisition strategy where they've gone out and acquired all these different vendors. Now we've got to figure out how do those solutions tie together? How does S4HANA integrate with Ariba and Concur and SuccessFactors and all these different solutions they've bought? That's a whole nother thing that we've got to deal with. So there's a lot of work to do before technology is mature to where it was, even just 5 years ago. It's going to take a few years to get these massive overhauls of the technology to the point we need to be. So technology is a risk, but the bigger risk are the process, the people, and the business side of things. And more often than not, we're overly focused on the technology piece. The things that have the biggest impact, now, when we're helping a client define how long is my project going to take, if I know the average for companies of all different sizes, different geographies, different industries, if I know the average is 18 months, which is about what it is for across the board, which is a very rough average with a lot of variation in that data, the average is 18 months. The way I know how to apply that average to me or to move that up or down is based on a number of different factors. One is certainly our company size, which is usually an easy one to scale that duration up or down. But then we also look at the degree of process change we're going through. Is this a big change for us or is this more of an incremental improvement? Those are two very different implementation durations, so we have to know which path we're going down. How capable are our people? What's our level of maturity with the current capabilities? Is this going to be a situation where they're using an AS400 and a lot of really manual processes, and now we're going to Microsoft Dynamics or Oracle, one of those systems with AI and machine learning and all this stuff? That's a huge jump, as opposed to a company that just implemented a relatively new ERP system 10 years ago, not a current, the most ideal situation, but not as much of a change as one that's been on the same system for 30 years. So we have to understand how big of a jump is this for people? How big of a change is this for technology? Are we going from an old version of AX to D365? That's a different jump than going from AS400 to D365. Those are two very different situations in terms of our ability to support and build that competency from a technology and IT perspective. So this is more focused on the IT capability. These two are more focused on the process and people capability across the whole business. And then we look at the geography, how many locations we have. Are we expanding the scope of what ERP means in the future versus what it is today? Is it going to be more integrated than what the solution is we have now? That adds a layer of complexity. How much experience does our internal team have with implementation experience? So if we have a subset of people on the team that have worked at other companies that have been through implementations, that internal knowledge is really important. You can always bring in outside support from people like us or your system integrator, but the more internal in-house knowledge you have around that, the better, because that's usually, it helps make it less likely that you're going to reject that outside perspective, if that makes sense. A lot of times if no one has any experience, we come in with what the reality is going to look like and you reject it because it just doesn't resonate, it doesn't make sense because you've never been through it before, and everything you're being told by the ecosystem is completely different than what the reality is you're being told by others. So only by having that internal experience, it helps validate the reality of what outside third parties, independent third parties might provide to you.
Do clients, are they pretty good at evaluating that, or are they sometimes way off?
Evaluating this whole thing?
No, the internal experience piece. It's like, do they think they have one thing and it's another, or?
No, usually they're pretty good. I mean, usually they know. I mean, if it's all, it's a highly tenured staff, and most people have only been through the implementation from 30 years ago, but never outside. They usually kind of know that, yeah, we don't have a lot of experience. But if it's a high growth company or there's been some attrition and you've brought in some people that's, new blood that has seen other situations, I think they generally have a good sense for the most part. So implementation readiness, what is it we're trying to accomplish as part of our transformation readiness approach? First is executive alignment. I have a whole session on that this morning around how do we get that strategic and executive alignment. If you weren't in that session, check out the slides. If you were in it, this will all tie back to that session from this morning. Operational readiness is another piece that we look at, which is how do we define our business processes and scenarios that we want to make sure that we have built into the system. And again, we're not talking here in the operational readiness, we're not talking about how to define the processes to a level of detail that is dependent on the technology. It's more, this is how we do business, regardless of what technology we use, this is how we interact with customers and stakeholders, and here's what we expect to see from a process flow and a data flow and how decisions are made. And we need to have that clarity and understanding of the different scenarios and exceptions so that we can have a clear blueprint for what it is we want the technology to do for us. Now, inevitably, there is going to be reconciliation that needs to happen between the technology we choose when we go to implement it, and that's okay. That we can reconcile that. But a lot of times vendors will say, no, don't worry about mapping or mapping out what you do today, because our best practices will define that for you. That's a bad idea, and it sounds like it's not a bad idea because you avoid the need to have to reconcile anything on paper at least. But the reality is there's going to be a lot worse than reconciliation, which is now you've got a system that doesn't fit what it is you need, and your people are going to reject the system because we haven't defined the technology in the context of how we need the business to operate. So it's one of those things that sounds good, we want to hear it, and it sounds like we don't want to reconcile or waste a lot of time on defining our business processes, which we don't want to overdo it. There is a fine line. You don't want to spend too much time on analysis paralysis and mapping out every possible scenario in a ton of detail, but you do want to have a general sense of what your business processes look like and what you want your future state to be so that we can better define how the technology can support that going forward.
Yeah, good question. So, if you've got limited resources, are you better off just focusing on the to-be process rather than the as-is? Because you could spend a huge amount of time with an organization that's quite mature trying to work out what the as-is is, but really you're just interested in what the future state is, or do you have to do both?
Well, you don't have to do both, but I've found that it's a lot more effective to do both for two reasons. One is because in order to get to the to-be, me as a person that's used, all I know is the as-is. I don't know the to-be yet. I can't start with a clean slate and define what I want without first defining what do I do today, why am I doing these things that I do, what are the pain points, and what should I be changing to help morph into that future state. So you don't want to spend a huge amount of time complaining about the processes and overanalyzing every single little broken detail, but there is some value in doing a limited amount of as-is to help us get to the future state. The other reason why the as-is is really important is because, we'll talk about this in the next session, from a change management perspective, we have to understand the gap between how things are today in order to connect the dots for people to get them to the future. So at some point we're going to have to do it. We could start with the to-be, and let's just say that part goes fine, and we're able to do that with a clean slate without worrying about the current state. In order to do change management effectively, you still have to go back to the current state to understand, well, how's that different, and how are we going to bring people along, and who's going to be impacted, and how do we get Susie to understand her new role in this future state. So from a change perspective, it's really important too. Sure. There's technical readiness. One thing that we try to advise a lot of our clients on is, as much as we can, let's start to build an internal competency. Let's do it right now. We don't have to wait till we hire a system integrator even. Let's start figuring out how we can train as much of our IT staff as we can on the technology we're about to deploy. So if we're about to deploy Infor, Epicor, whatever the software is, let's find some ways to get them trained on it, either through the vendor or third-party training, to build that competency so that we're more educated and we know more and can make informed decisions and be on equal footing with the system integrator or the implementation partner, rather than the implementation partner having all the knowledge around how the technology works. And because we don't know any better, we just defer to what the vendor would do. And so that's a really important point, and it also builds a much more sustainable level of competency within the organization if we start from the day one, I'm building that competency in-house. It's easy to say, well, we're not experts. Why would we try to learn it when we could just hire the system integrator? Just trust me when I say there's a lot of value in learning as much as you can about the technology. Even if all you do is learn how the software works, you get trained on the configuration tools, the integration tools, the customization tools. The more you know in your IT group about that stuff, the more informed they will be to be able to be a part of the solution and owning parts of the solution rather than just the system integrator owning it. And one thing that having been part of a system integrator from early in my career and having worked with a number of them in the years since, one thing about big system integrators, it's almost like the Wizard of Oz. It's a kind of a big black box that, you know, don't look behind the curtain. We will bring you the solution, and we don't want you looking behind the curtain and being collaborative in how that's developed. Now, on paper, they'll tell you, yeah, you're going to have we'll work with one of your functional leads alongside with one of our functional leads. But the reality is they're just drawing out of that person what they need, and they'll go away and build whatever they're going to build, and then they'll come back, you'll test it, you'll tell them it works or it doesn't, and then they'll go fix it, and then they'll come back and they'll train you. And so that dynamic needs to change to where you're part of that and you're going behind the curtain and you're part of that solution. They may not want you to, but again, you know, it's your project, and you need to have ownership and visibility into what's going on if you want it to be successful, especially in the longer term. People readiness, change management, we're going to talk about that in the next session, so I won't dive into that in too much detail right now. But the idea here is it's never too early to start change management. There's always something we can be starting now. What that is, I'll talk about in the next session, but there's an assessment that we recommend doing early in the project that will help determine what that is you should be doing. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. I can't tell you that if you're about to start an implementation, you need to be doing X, Y, and Z. All I can tell you is you should be doing an assessment to figure out how severe the potential resistance to change is going to be, where the change management issues and risks are going to be, so that we can start developing a change management plan that becomes part of the overall implementation plan. And until we have a good change management plan, we don't really have a good implementation plan, because the change management plan, more often than not, will drive the duration and the cost of the implementation plan. So a lot of times companies just want to wait and deal with that later, but if we do that, all of a sudden we've created a big problem, because now we're forcing ourselves, we're boxing ourselves in and predefining how much time we do or don't have for change management, when in fact that usually takes longer than the actual technical work stream itself. And then project governance. Getting the right project governance in place so that you, the organization, not the software vendor, not the system integrator, not third stage, not your independent consultants, none of them should be owning the governance. You guys should be. You can be taking inputs from people like us or your system integrator, but ultimately it's your project governance, and you determine how decisions get made. It's easy to say that look at recommendations from other system integrators. It's easy to take that and just say we're going to deploy their project governance, but usually their project governance is very weak. So having something that helps identify risks objectively, whether it makes the third parties and the consultants look bad or not, is very important, because we need to know what they are so that we can mitigate them along the way. So the whole idea with implementation readiness is we want to optimally engage with the system integrator. We want to be partners with them. We want to be on even footing. We don't want to be, by default, lacking knowledge that causes us just to have a sense of helplessness. I mean, that's what ends up happening with a lot of companies, is they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the time, so they just kind of defer to the system integrator, and it creates this learned helplessness to where the system integrator can never go away. I mean, if the system integrator goes away, it becomes very painful and disruptive to the business, and they know it too. So the system integrators know that you're becoming dependent on them, and it may sound good in theory that they'll transfer all the knowledge to you eventually and they'll roll off, but typically what happens is you plan on that, but they end up staying at a high level of engagement for a lot longer than you expect, because you didn't have the right level of engagement and ownership and knowledge and things that are required to support the project effectively. And this is especially true if the system integrator creates your processes and your technology in a way that's misaligned with what your needs are, which is highly likely because you weren't involved or as involved in the decision making and the processes as you should have been. And so that creates even more reliance and dependency on the system integrator, because now they've got to fix and refine and pivot and do all the agile, in the name of agile, they're going to go fix all the stuff that wasn't right the first time. So that sort of thing is a another dynamic to watch out for. So this is something that's very important to show. This is something we actually show when we're suggesting to clients how we would work with them. And the reason I show this is because even when we're recommending how if someone's considering us third stage as a company to work with them, we always put the client at the top. I mean, you guys are in charge of this. We are here to support, and we will be an extension of your team. We'll provide, be co-responsible with you. We'll provide tools and knowledge and advice and recommendations, but ultimately you decide. I mean, you're making the decisions on what it is you do and don't do, what kind of risk you're willing to take. We advise you on the risk trade-offs, and you decide. We'll give you the recommendations, and ultimately you decide. And probably the one thing that, having been a consultant my whole career, the thing I like least about being a consultant is that sometimes my recommendations don't matter, or sometimes they don't become reality because it's not my business, and I have the luxury of being outside looking in, and I can play armchair quarterback, but only you as a client can understand the internal political dynamics and constraints and resource realities that you have. All I can do is tell you what I think you should do, and ultimately the client decides. So that's the one thing I don't like about being a consultant, but it is the reality, and it's a very important reality, because if any of these parties were making all the decisions for you, or you were taking every recommendation that's made to you from a third party, you don't really own it. You're just you're just stamping off whatever someone else tells you. So it's important to have that dynamic in place. And then the system integrator would typically do all the things they do, which is the more technical expertise, the functional configuration, the testing, all that good stuff. But there's a lot of stuff that system integrators don't do or don't do well that you want to make sure you do to fill in the gaps, whether it's change management or data migration or overall program management to manage other third-party integrations or whatever the case may be. Typically that's outside the wheelhouse of the system integrator, and a lot of our clients don't want the system integrator to own everything. There's some value in breaking that up and having hedging a bit and having multiple parties potentially support that. And this is especially true if you are going with a solution that's not all in on one ERP system. So you might have one ERP system and a separate HCM or CRM or MES system, whatever it is, and that's okay. I mean, it's okay to have that. It's not a bad thing to have a best-of-breed approach, but if that is the case, you need someone to manage all the different moving parts throughout a transformation like that. So some of the components of implementation readiness, this is a lot of detail here, and this is something I'm going to cover tomorrow morning in the digital strategy session. But generally, just to summarize this in advance of tomorrow's presentation, where we'll get into this in more detail, this is the whole process that we recommend clients to go through, or at least the tools that are available to go through to get to a decision on what is our roadmap, what technology are we going to deploy, or technologies are we going to deploy, how are we going to do it, how are we going to account for the costs and the risks and the benefits, all that good stuff. And it gets us to a point here where we've got a decision, we've got a general roadmap, and now we need to figure out from this point forward, what do? We don't want to just jump straight into implementation. There's a phase here that we need to define. We may not know what it is, and that's what we'll talk about here in the next few slides. So I'm going to actually go a little bit out of order here. So this slide is that next phase. So once we've finished the digital strategy, which is over here on the left, the slide we just reviewed, now we get into this whole implementation readiness phase, which generally there's 5 things that we recommend clients focus on, or at least 5 work streams that we recommend clients focus on. One is that strategic and executive alignment piece, which I discussed earlier today in more detail, which is making sure that we have a clear vision for what this project is. We're making clear decisions at the executive level and having clear ownership at the executive level, so that by the time the project team inherits this project and moves forward with executing the project, it's done so in a way that's aligned with the way the executives want the project to look and the decisions that they need to make to support the business and the project going forward. So strategic and executive alignment, this also includes education, so making sure that executives understand what this project means and what the trade-offs are, and we've started to identify and neutralize or mitigate some of the misunderstandings or the myths that executives oftentimes have, or misconceptions they often have about these types of implementations. We've started to mitigate some of those challenges during this phase as well. The operational readiness, that's the piece I talked about before, which is just unpacking it a little bit more, which is now we're defining some of our business processes in more detail than others, Generally, the more strategic business processes are ones that we do want to spend some time defining the current into the future state so that we have a clear vision and blueprint for what the system and the technology and the new processes need to support. And again, we're not getting into transactional details of what buttons you push and what screens you use because we're not there yet. We're not designing software. We're defining what our business processes are and making sure that the software can fit within those business processes. People readiness, which is the change management. I'd say the biggest things that are the most important here are first of all to do this readiness assessment, which we call it a people readiness or organizational readiness assessment, where we do an assessment, this quantitative online survey and qualitative focus groups that identifies and measures the culture of the company, the magnitude of change they're about to go through, and identifies potential points of resistance or areas that are bound to be problems for that client to deploy new technology. And so the reason we do that is because that's going to formulate and be an input into our change management plan so that we have a strategy and a plan that's specific to us and specific to the things that we identified in the readiness assessment. And then the second piece that's really important at this point in the project is to start identifying organizational role design and the impacts that we're going to see as a result of a new deployment. Usually, even before we start building the software, we already kind of know that there's some major changes. There's some low-hanging fruit of changes that we know are going to happen organizationally. It might be that we know we're going to centralize certain processes, or we're going to move to a shared services model, or that we know we're going to operate in a common platform across different departments or locations, and we're not doing that today. So that we know those areas are going to be more impacted and change is going to be harder for those groups than other groups where maybe it's not as big of a change. So we've started to identify the change impacts at a work group level, at a location level, departmental level, that sort of thing. And then on the technical readiness piece, tomorrow Daryl from Validatum is going to talk about data cleansing and mapping. So that is one that we recommend that you start earlier than later. This ends up on the critical path of most implementations that we're involved with, the whole data piece of it. So the sooner you can start, even though we aren't ready to start mapping and moving data over yet because we haven't even started building the software yet or configuring the software yet, we can, though, start assessing the data we have and figuring out what is our plan in parallel with the rest of the project to clean that data, eventually map that data, figure out our strategy for what we're going to bring over or not. The sooner we can start that, the better, because this so often gets pushed out to the very end. It's almost like, oh yeah, we're about to finish up testing, but we haven't figured out the data thing. So let's go see what we can do with the data and bring over some sample data, and then you realize, well, data's a mess and data doesn't quite map the way we want it to, and now we've created a delay because data hasn't been addressed early enough on. She can explain that a lot better than I can, so I'm going to stop there on the data cleansing piece, but that is an important part of the technical readiness. And we actually, when you hear her speak tomorrow, if you haven't already heard her speak, she and her company act as the data migration arm of third stage. So when we have a project where there's data needs, her team is that team underneath our umbrella. So that's the level of specialization that's required there and is very important. And then there's also the other piece of this is the architecture and the overall integration plan. So really understanding what systems are we keeping, what systems are going away, of the ones that are staying, or the ones that we're bringing in that are third party, not our core ERP, but third party systems we're deploying. How is this all going to tie together? What's our integration plan? What's the integration and test plan and all that good stuff that goes along with it? So this technical readiness piece is very important to figure out what this all looks like instead of just going and building core ERP without figuring out or understanding how the rest of it's going to tie together. We need to have a plan for how that's all going to integrate. And then having that project governance in place is extremely important. Those are some of the activities that we identify early on. And generally, we advise that if you haven't identified a laundry list of risks already, by the time you start your implementation, then something's wrong. You're missing something because there's always risks, even at the point you start the project. A lot of times companies think, well, how can we have risk yet? We haven't even started. Well, you should by that point. There should be a lot of risk that you're recognizing in terms of not problems, but just things that are going to be challenging or things that are unique to you that you know are going to be a challenge from a change perspective or a technology perspective, whatever the case may be.
Eric, in the case where they've selected the SI, they've already got the SI involved, how much overlap I mean, does the SI fight you for some of this stuff?
I wouldn't say they fight us for it, but they don't necessarily want it to happen. And there are some things that they'll claim to do. A lot of these things they'll say, well, we're going to do business processes, as part of our future state workshop, so you don't need to worry about that. Strategic executive alignment, we have some stakeholder plans, and that's part of our change management plan. We'll do that during change management later on. So that's a lot of the kind of thing you hear, but we're not talking about deploying technology and stakeholder plans for deploying technology. We're talking about just getting aligned on what this project means. And if you've already engaged a system integrator by that point, you're a little too late. Not too late, but you're later than you should be. And it's never too late, though, to back up and say, okay, let's make sure we're all in sync before we continue going too far down that path. But they do, because of the independence, we're not there to sugarcoat anything. We're not there to sell more software or to, sell the bench of people in India that are going to be developing configuring the software. We have nothing to lose by recommending certain things. They have a lot to lose by hearing some of the messaging that comes out of this. So yes, there is a dynamic of pushback for sure on that. And that's okay. I mean, it's your project. Ultimately, the companies implementing have to decide what is best for them.
I was going to say, as an implementer, we go in, talking about project governance, we go in with risks. We've already started a risk plan, and sometimes they are surprised to see, what do you mean there's risks already? Yeah. Well, we've identified risks as we've gotten to know, our clients and our prospects.
Do you do that as part of your, like the sales cycle, the business development cycle? So even before you've sold them, even before they've chosen you, you've already said.
Well, and we could be evaluating them at the same time. Our goal is to have successful implementations at the end of the day. So, we do a fair amount of evaluation up front. And so a big part of our internal handoff from sales to delivery is, hey, what are the risks that we've already identified as part of that? And then that flows directly into, the project governance conversations that we have, our PMs have with our clients. So, but it's interesting that the clients are surprised that there's already risk identified.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know about other implementers, but where I am, we are doing that. So
it's pretty rare, and partly because of the dynamic you described, which is clients aren't expecting it, and a lot of implementers and salespeople, I think, are afraid that hurts them to identify the risk, because now you've created some sort of doubt or uncertainty, and that's the last thing you want. You just want to close. I'm not saying you, but a salesperson oftentimes wants to close the deal, and so there's a perceived disruption to that end goal, which is to close the deal and move forward. So that's pretty rare, but it's good that you guys do. I think it's the right thing to do. I think people appreciate it. I mean, when they hear it, usually they appreciate knowing the risk because they wouldn't have otherwise known.
Right. They haven't thought about it.
Yeah. The next few slides I won't dive into just because I'll let you read them, but each of these slides coincides with one of the 5 work streams here. So I kind of gave you a high-level overview of each of the 5, but then the next 5 slides dive into each of those work streams, talk about the kind of work streams we go through, the activities, the objectives you want to get out of that. So the idea here is we want to give you a framework that you could start to apply and use pieces of that you feel like might apply to your organization to help that readiness piece, or to enable that readiness piece. Generally, a lot of times companies will say, well, how long does this process take? And a lot of it depends on the size of the company and how ready they are and the level of maturity they're at. But generally, for a mid-sized to larger organization, it could take anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Generally, is where you get to that point where, okay, we've got a pretty solid springboard launching point. We're never 100% ready. We could always spend another 6 or 12 months, but at some point you get diminishing returns where you are delaying the project. But generally, in that 3 to 6 month range for most companies is kind of the time frame that gets you to a point where, okay, we feel we're not all the way there yet. There's a lot of stuff running in parallel that will continue on these paths, but at least we're a lot better off now than we were 90 days ago or 6 months ago, to where we can take ownership. We can own this. We can manage the system integrator, or at the very least be on even footing with the system integrator to be part of the decision making, and really just know what we're getting ourselves into. Another part of this too, this is an important point I didn't really get into, which is mobilizing the change team, and also just mobilizing the overall project team. A lot of times the team itself internally hasn't been fully fleshed out yet, but yet the system integrator is there. That's a huge problem. If your system integrator shows up before you've got the project team identified, that you're already off track at that point, because now you're getting that much further behind where the system integrator is, and you'll never catch up to them because they inherently know more than you and are more experienced than you in this whole journey, and so you'll never catch up. So that's really important too, is to, you know, if you could slow things down and start to get caught up or at least get closer, you're just going to be more, the dynamic shifts at that point, you'll be more equipped to handle the project. There's a slide here that talks about the business process and the operational readiness piece. Some of the things we look at when we're mapping that future state. And like I said, if you ever want to talk about how deep do we get, how do we figure out what processes we focus on or not, we have a whole framework I could share with you that helps explain that in more detail. Change management we'll talk about later in just a few minutes, and then you can see the rest of the slides here in more detail. So one last thing I'll share, and then I'll just see what questions you have before we take a break into the next slide, or the next session. And these are actually two slides that if you were in Stuart's QA session earlier today, you've seen these two slides before. If you weren't, these are new. So I'll go through them quickly just to not be overly redundant for those that weren't, or that were there. But having a quality assurance process in place early and getting that in place early during the implementation readiness phase is very important, because it gives you a project governance mechanism that allows you to do a lot of the things that I just talked about, which is to have control of your project, have good governance in place, manage your system integrator, be on even footing with the system integrator, all that stuff we've talked about so far. It also gives you a framework to identify the risks before they become problems. So really, you do want to be identifying risks before you see or feel the pain. If we wait until we see or feel the pain of the risk, then it's probably too late. We use that canary in the coal mine analogy of, you know, coal miners used to have canaries in the mine, and the canaries are singing until they die, and then they realize that there's a gas leak that's killing the canaries, and they can get out before they die too. And again, not to be overly draconian or dramatic about it, but it is a good way to think about or visualize, you know, the ways that we should be identifying the risk before we see the pain of it. Because if we see the pain of it, it's too late to effectively mitigate it before we get to our go live. And then there's a lot of other things I'll let you read here. But the whole idea here is this project QA framework can be used early on in the implementation readiness phase, and it's the same framework we use in expert witness engagements too. So when we're assessing and analyzing expert witness engagements, or if we're doing a project recovery from a failure, we use the same framework. In fact, we built the framework from those types of engagements, and then we pulled it forward and started using it as part of our QA early on in projects with clients. So it's very battle tested. The QA framework's been tested in some pretty extreme cases of extreme failure, and so the idea is if it's battle tested there in a failure, let's pull it forward and use it to identify the risks before they ever become huge problems. And so this is that overall QA framework that covers a lot of stuff, a lot of detail here. But if you look at just the headings in dark blue across the top here, these top two rows, these are all the different lenses that we typically will analyze and assess risk and identify issues and challenges to make sure we're staying on track and we're mitigating the risks along the way as we go through the project. You can see it ranges from everything from the initial procurement of the software and the contract T's and C's and a lot of the stuff that Marcus and Daniel talked about earlier today or yesterday, all the way through project governance, project management, resources, to the technical side of it, the organizational change, data, testing, security, et cetera. There's a lot of different lenses that you have to be looking at in these projects, and it's hard because a lot of times these projects are so big, they get structured in a way that's very siloed, and you don't have anyone that's kind of looking at the big picture and identifying all the different lenses or risks that you should be identifying, and doing it in a way that's objective, that's not meant to make anyone look bad, but it's also not trying to hide or bury risks. It's meant to bring them to the surface to where we can figure out how do we prioritize them, how do we address them. Some risks are more important than others. Some are low burn types of risks that they're there, but we're not going to deal with them yet, but we're just keeping an eye on them. Others are high priority showstoppers that we've got to deal with right away. So that's the whole idea here is drawing out that, using that quality assurance mindset early on in the implementation readiness to get conditioned for going through the implementation and being able to continue to identify those risks along the way. So that's implementation readiness at a high level. What questions or comments do you guys have?
Question.
Sure.
What we run into a lot is, this is understood and agreed by everyone here. A lot of people that we talk to say, yeah, we need to do this, we get it. But when it gets into, you finalize the selection, you're getting into it and running this by, call it an executive team, what are some approaches to getting them on board when it comes down to this? They perceive this as extending the project. We know this actually accelerates the project, but you can't just tell them that. This actually makes it cheaper, but they don't want to hear that. What are some tactics to get executive teams bought in?
It's a good question, and it's similar to a question that came up this morning when we were talking about executive alignment. Someone in this general area, it was you, that asked about, I just remember it was this side of the room, asked about how do you get the, how do you do these executive alignment sessions if you can't even convince the executives they need to get aligned or they need to have these workshops? So it's a similar kind of question. It's a good one. And what I said and what I think applies here too is when we go to strategic and executive alignment, one of the things we do is this executive boot camp where it's meant to be more of a condensed, think of it as a condensed version of Stratosphere, a much executive summary view of everything you're learning here over the last couple days. It's meant to be that executive view to help educate on what these projects typically look like, what to expect, what do we need of them, what do we need of the executives as part of this project, and draw out the misunderstandings and the, yeah, but what we understand is this, or here's why we think that's not a problem because we were told that best practices will solve that problem, or pre-configured solutions are going to fix that problem. So it's a dialogue and education around, well, you're fixing one risk over here, but here's what the risk is now that you've traded off for, and making sure they understand that. So a lot of times it's starting with maybe not biting off the entire readiness and saying you need to do the readiness, but having an initial readiness assessment that includes an executive education type of session up front. That's one way.
Make that part of the selection work itself. If they're perceiving them as just, you got selection, you got implementation, make that executive boot camp and call it a hybrid planning phase as part of the selection activity, and that might at least open some eyes.
Yeah, it's a great point, because when we're doing the selection for clients, the evaluation and selection of software, generally we know them, we're getting to know them well enough, and we've built a rapport and relationship and credibility that makes it a little bit easier for us to advise on where the risks are, why they need that readiness phase. If we're coming in at this point and this is kind of a new concept and we're coming as consultants, it can be a little bit harder to convey the message because we haven't had the education and conversations leading up to that point. Other questions? This is an area I'd be happy to Robin's point, offline have side conversations once you've digested some of this, or have more of a Q&A type discussion. Be happy to do that outside this, because I know this one is one that we get comments. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of words and a lot of graphics on these slides, and I do acknowledge that. So we just want to give you the flyover, and as you absorb it and digest it and think about it, be happy to chat more about it too. So, all right. Well, why don't we take a break here, and we'll start again in about 5 minutes.